I love that picture. And then, yeah.
So a senior year, I had him grow up.
But
Almost all the class.
But somebody's speaking to me.
it's a long boring story.
I like that. I've never heard that third part of it.
I never heard it until he
Yes, absolutely. We just, Jim, you know Jim, anywhere he goes, he's gonna turn the chair around.
Oh, okay. So we got like we're making a coffee circle.
Yeah, that's what we have.
And that's why
Jim
it
wants
says
to
this
see the coffee
belongs
circle.
to yours.
Don't look at me like that. I'm just telling the truth,
I
you
keep
know,
that
that concept.
monitor.
Yeah, you did that with this chair too, but I had to fix it. I just didn't have a chance to fix that one.
I am the IT department.
Okay.
But I can't seem to figure out how to print it.
You have like mermaid scales.
I've been crying nonstop.
Well, that is a good.
Yeah,
I mean, I may have
it
shut
is.
it down.
I showed that I have feelings.
Yeah.
It's tough.
And then I got well.
Yeah, I have feelings. Yes, but I don't have a heart. Feelings just not a heart.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, did you see the, no, it's
No,
tonight.
wait, I have. Okay, no, don't see, because I didn't do the last season. I didn't do the last
The last
season.
thing was.
No spoilers, but I want to say this, you remember that creep that I used to take? Okay, he really would get me into some. Yeah.
I wasn't born today.
Yeah, I was. Anyway, he really would get me into stuff like that. And he got on Facebook and found it. And so we became friends with the actor.
What?
Yes, so on Facebook. And then, hang on, David, hang on. Look at you.
She's trying so hard.
So hard. You are so good. That is hilarious. You're Spider. You got Spider-Man. Not Spider-Man, but Spider-Man.
Hey, Chris,
Anyhow,
what
one of
are
our
you doing history
friends
like was?
in Texas was a wow, did a little cut, red ink on Barbara's cheek. Hang on, baby. Oh, now you got a spider.
Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Season's greetings and sanitation. Let's keep this clean, okay? My name is Jim Lindsley, and this is the Arkansas Society of Free Thinkers. Well, there are a couple of different names for it. It's called here the monthly meeting, and we'll call it that for right now. Anyway, the Arkansas Society of Free Thinkers is a nonprofit organization that maintains is where our chief objective is separation of church and state, and bells ringing in the audience. And it wasn't written here, but I thought that was cute. Anyway, scientific and humanistic viewpoint in improving the lives of non-believers or people that just don't believe the typical, stuff. Anyway, if you're interested in joining the organization or finding out more about it, we are online, and there's also information at the back table. And I got to say this: anybody heard of Bertrand Russell? I see several people that one of his statements was that you could. Please correct me on this, okay? Something about you could prove you couldn't prove there was a God any more than you could prove there was a celestial teapot on the other side of the moon. I believe that's somewhat correct. And my point is, we have the celestial teapot back at the back of the room, and if you'd like to put a donation into it, we'd be glad to see that. And you can also sign up and give us your name and address and telephone number and your mother's first. I'm sorry. You don't have to put all that information in there unless you just want to. We'll be glad to follow up. At any rate, let's see. This is a standard disclosure, I think. Our standard disclaimer. ASF is a diverse organization with members who present a wide range of opinions. The speakers who present their monthly meeting do not necessarily represent the views of ASF. However, there's probably a good theme there that we kind of go along with. Anyway, as ASF, we are a 501c3, and we cannot support specific people or candidates for any government office. However, we can promote, various causes like separation of church and state, scientific literacy, social programs and truthfulness and stuff like that. Yeah, just one of those things. Anyway, with all of that aside, we have several different things that we do. Thank you. Several different things that we segments of this program, I guess you would say. And the first one we have is our dear friend Bern. What is your name? Bern Bradley, and he's going to present us the free thought of the day. Bern Bradley, let's give him a round of applause here.
You all know by now that when I share a free thought of the day or a skeptical sidebar or anything else, it's generally something that I'm reading at the time. And I just downloaded for my monthly Audible book, Bill Clinton's new book, Citizen. And it's all about his life after the White House. The Clinton Global Initiative, the Clinton Health Initiative, which he calls CHI, and the Clinton Foundation, and the Clinton Library Presidential Center. I happened to be there the day that the library was open. It was raining heavily. Good deal. And one thing he said is my mother would tell me not to complain about the rain because somewhere there's a farmer that needs it. U2, Bono and The Edge from U2 were both there, and they sang the Beatles song, When the Rain Comes. And they changed one of the lyrics to, when the rain comes, they run and not hide their heads. We got 4 presidents out of bed. There were four presidents at that thing. All the former living presidents were there except Gerald Ford, and he was too ill to attend. However, we're living in a time when people are not necessarily having fun anymore. They look back at yesterday and they think everything was just great yesterday. If we could only go back to yesterday. And that's both of the wide sides of the political spectrum think that a lot. And this is one line out of a chapter, and I don't think that when he wrote this, he thought it had any special significance, but it did to me. And I think it's really great. And so Bill Clinton says, when you have more yesterdays than tomorrows, living in the present and for the future requires nurturing good memories and making peace with the less happy ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Vernon. I appreciate that, and I'd like to recognize some of the people in this organization that have helped bring this thing to fruition. That's the right word, isn't it, Vern? Fruition? Yeah, anyway. And one in particular is Brian, Brian at the back of the room. We'll stand up, and he is the cameraman and live streamer. Yes, sir. And then we have Chris Barecki, who is the president, and you can stand up. See there, he can stand up. And an amalgamation of a lot of other people here, but it takes people to do these things. We have Dawn. I'm sorry to say that she has announced that she is going to be leaving to go to Texas, to of all places, to help take care of her parents. Dawn is an only child. I don't know how much of your history I'm going to tell it all today. What day are you leaving, Dawn?
We don't know yet. It will probably be sometime the first week in January.
Oh, really? That's not what I heard earlier today. Okay, you weren't going to be around for my birthday on the 30th of December.
Oh, I thought it was the 30th of January.
Oh, no. Okay. Good. All right. Anyway, we're a bunch of people that a lot of us know each other, and we'd like to invite you guys out there in Yaya land to come visit us on every third Sunday of the month at 1 o'clock at the UU Church on Reservoir Road, 1818 Reservoir Road, I believe it is. And also we have other events during the week, during the year, during the month and everything. And we'll go into some of that a little bit later on. But right now, we have another speaker that we want to introduce. His name is Jerry is it Schultz or Schultz? Schultz. That's what I was thinking. But you know, anyway, I just call you Jerry most of the time. Anyway, Jerry Schultz has the skeptical sidebar. Jerry, come on up here. Thank you, Jerry.
First, there's no problem at all with people having difficulty pronouncing my name because my family does. The name in German is Schulze, which nobody could say. So my dad and his brothers all ended up pronouncing it differently. My dad chose Schulze because it's 2 syllables. His big brother probably took the best choice, which was Schultz, which people usually think it is. And his younger brother chose to pronounce it as Kincaid. In any event, I was trying to think of something because I'm always on the internet and arguing with people about things and debunking nonsense. And I thought certainly I will come across something, you know, between now when I told people I would do this and today when I'm doing it. And what I happened to was somebody was asking people about their memories of The Passion of the Christ, that movie, the Mel Gibson snuff film. And I thought, you know, what I remember about it now was a little different from what I think most other people did. First, I was very annoyed at the fake realism that they had pretending to use the languages when in fact they had the speakers who were supposedly speaking Latin were speaking church Latin. There is a difference between ecclesiastical Latin and classical Latin, and somehow that really grated on me the wrong way. Maybe I was missing the point, but that was one of the things. And the other thing that I noticed is those of you who were subjected to Catholicism as a youth probably would have noticed that there's a lot of similarities here, not so much to the Gospels, but to the Stations of the Cross. And I see a former Catholic out there saying, yeah, I recognize that. And it was interesting to me that after all these years, it wasn't the sadism or the violence or, you know, the general absurdity of it, but it was to me, that's church Latin that came along hundreds of years later, and nobody would have been speaking it. And besides, most of the so-called Romans, like the Roman militia of the Roman army, would have been using Greek anyway. So much for that. And why would I remember that? I don't know, but that was what popped into my mind. I don't remember in the whole conversation anybody else thinking that was a problem, but I did. So I thought that would be a good topic for Skeptical Sidebar. Always be looking out for inauthenticity. It's there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. It's always cool to hear from you. Jerry has a long list of qualifications, and I can't go into it right now.
Thank you.
Yeah. We also have one of our other things that we do on our program is we have a member story, something that is kind of close to someone who is a member, and I'd like to present to you right now. If you will come up here. Or you want to speak from your seat? Okay.
No, I'll come up. Introduce me.
Okay, Don, come on up.
So the last name you can't pronounce?
Yes.
He can't pronounce the last name.
Is it?
No.
Okay.
Greetings, and it's Guerra. And Vern, I am going to read. Even though it's a story from my heart, it's easier if I read it. I won't miss anything. Okay, guys, you know I could begin with some sort of soliloquy about my time in the pen. And this is not the day that we're beating up Catholic schools, but yes, my pen was the Catholic schools. Instead, guys, I'm going to talk to you guys how I discovered this wonderful group of people. I was working at North Little Rock High School. I had my daily lunch with a marvelous teacher and friend, Betsy Jones. She saw something in me that was a little different, So she began to share with me this group of free-thinking folks. She said that I might like this group. It was interesting, challenging, fun, friendly, and a great group of folks to hang with. She was right. I began coming to meetings, going to parties, dinners, lunches, and assorted other activities, because we've got them all. I met great people, had a ball, and became a member. That was about 12 years ago, and I've been having a blast with free thinkers ever since. Now, like the rest of you, I was born an atheist. After adoption, though, by a devoted Roman Catholic couple, I was enrolled for 12 years in Catholic schools. Now, I'm jazzed about that because I got a great quality of education, the means in which those crazy nuns taught me how to study, how to learn, how to communicate. But the one thing that they did teach was critical thinking skills. A little bit of a contradiction there, but we won't go into that. The only issue that I ever had, though, was religion. I remember when Sister Martha was teaching about Roman and Greek mythology, and this was in 6th grade. I asked her, because I was one of those kind of students, get the hand up, always the kid with the questions. I asked her if the Greeks and Romans still believed in those gods. She chuckled and told me, oh, no, Dawn Marie, and I got the middle name. They no longer believed in those gods, the false gods. Now they believed in our one, true, powerful, almighty God. So I asked her, well, if 5,000 or so years ago they believed in those gods and now they believe in another, and I was very honest in my question, who are we going to believe in 5,000 years from now? She looked. She tilted her head, and she gave me that eyebrow thing. This is where I learned to do this, because of Sister Martha. Nevertheless, she had a moment, and she said, well, now we all believe in the one true God, so we're not going to change. Looking back, I realized that that was my first moment as a recovering atheist. If their minds could be changed back then with the concept of a God, our minds must be able to change as well. So I realized it was kind of crazy to believe. Now, I kept my mouth shut because I went to a Catholic school, and that was a smart thing to do. It would have been rather unsafe if I said anything else. Well, I graduated from the Catholic school and became a good Catholic mother, wife, and everybody else. I did everything in my parish. I taught CCD, which is another way to say Sunday school. I was an RCIA teacher, Eucharistic minister, choir cantor, lector, ladies' altar society, etc. If it was needed to be done, they knew who to come to get it done. I was there to help out. I was so indispensable to my parish that when I started to question things, my parish priest said, hey, you know that there's an organization in Shawnee, Oklahoma at St. Gregory's University, and they're working with our diocese here. We're offering a 3-year scriptural degree in scriptural theology. And I said, well, Father, that's great, but I can't afford it. And so he said to me, you know what? You do as much as you do in this parish. We'll take care of it. I thought, that's great. Thank you so much. Not a real good idea. This 3-year program was great, and I wanted to know more. And the more I got to start understanding, the more I started realizing this is not right. And so I did what every good Catholic woman does. I began to pray. And I prayed, and I prayed, and I prayed. And for months, no answers, no responses, nothing. I kept asking for guidance, and then it started to hit me. I'm asking for guidance, and there's nobody there to guide me. So I started to read. I started to read Hitchens, and Dawkins, and Adams, and Asimov, and Sartre, even Nietzsche, in Spanish. I read from these writers that my thoughts weren't crazy. They weren't odd, they weren't strange, and they certainly were not going to send me to hell. I love you guys, this group of folks. I love the friendships and the fellowships that I've experienced here. And I want to thank you guys all for being such great friends. And thank you for whoever invented the internet so we can all still stay in touch. Thank you.
you won't believe it, but I always call Dom, Dom. And also, I took French in high school, and I didn't take Spanish, which is something I should have taken, obviously. But I never learned to roll my R's. My R's were a d, and my double R's were just non-existent. And so, thank you, Don Guerra.
That'll work.
Okay. Anyway, if you find something interesting that you'd like to maybe get involved or check in to see about getting involved with Arkansas Society of Free Thinkers, you know, we're online. And correct me, Chris, on this. I believe it's AF. It's there. It is. There it is. ARFreethinkers.org. Yes, ARFreethinkers.org. Yes, right here, ladies and gentlemen. We're also on Facebook, and you know, just get a hold of us, and we'd be glad to talk to you. And we will indoctrinate you into whatever we think you need to be. Well, actually, that's not true. We try to be friendly and work with people, and you know, hey, there are people out there that don't understand and or believe things the way we do, and we understand that. But we try to work with people and bring them around to the reality. You know, I'm kidding there. So, if you'd like to be involved in some of these things, even you people in the audience as well, if you have an experience, like a memory story or experience of how you became to believe whatever it is you believe, that'd be cool. We'd love to hear that. And any of the other skeptical sidebar, etc. I'd like to, right now, it's my opportunity to introduce to you our speaker, who is, by the way, this is yours up here. I haven't tasted of it at all, so you can have, I don't know, that may not be much, but anyway, you can have that. Our speaker today is Stephen Barger, PhD, and he is a top graduate of the Department of Biology at Hendrix College with a PhD in cellular biology at Vanderbilt University, has a postdoctorate training at the Sanders Brown Center on Aging at the University of Kentucky. He was the first recipient of the Englewood Fellowship for Alzheimer's Research at UAMS and is currently the Louise G. Hearn Endowed Chair in Dementia and Professor of Geriatrics and Neuroscience. Dr. Barger has published over 100 scientific articles in the field of neuroscience in journals such as Nature and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. His work has been cited nearly 20,000 times by other scientists, making him among the top 2% scientists in history. He has also been responsible for bringing over $9.5 million in funding to UAMS. Dr. Barger has been a member of the ACLU of Arkansas since 2008 and has held the positions of president and vice president at times during those years. He has served as senior editor of Neurology of Aging and the Journal of Neurochemistry. He also served as member of the Alzheimer's, did I pronounce it right? Alzheimer's? Great, I work on that. He served as senior editor of If you ever lose your place, don't let people know about it. Okay, he served as senior editor at Neurology of Aging and the Journal of Neurochemistry. He's also served as a member of the Alzheimer's Disease Advisory Board for the Arkansas General Assembly, and it's good to have some smart people there for a change. Dr. Barger is an accomplished geriatric scientist whose work helps us unravel mysteries of aging-related diseases. On top of all this, he also has time to work with multiple environmental and socio-economic nonprofits and avidly pursues sports and activities. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I had to edit the heck out of this thing to get it this short. So I've abbreviated Dr. Barger's list of accomplishments, awards, and responsibilities so you would have more time to listen to what he has to say instead of listening to me. You can applaud that. Anyway, okay, I'd like to introduce to you someone who is not only a fantastically educated, concerned, and actively involved individual, but also someone I consider a good friend and someone everyone should get to know. Please give a warm welcome for Dr. Stephen W. Barger. Come on up here. Thank you, Jim.
That's nice. I always counted Jim as a friend. I'm glad to know he feels the same way. Let's see, how do I get out of here? Oh,
And
okay.
yeah, and then you're minimized down there. And then F11 down.
I spoke to this group, I think about a year and a half ago, about my work. And so I figured you'd all be bored if I did that again. Although we have made a little bit of progress. If we want to talk about it later, we're working really now on the intersection of sex and sex-related hormones on late life dementia. So that's really been kind of fascinating. But motivated largely by recent events and just developing thoughts that I've had throughout my life and career, I wanted to try to approach something a little different today and really kind of broaden my application of scientific principles, notably biology and genetics, to sociological matters that might be timely. And in that sense, I'm really kind of out of my depth to some extent, and there are probably some among the audience here who know more about some of this stuff than I do. And so I would like to think about this more as kind of a discussion where I'm going to throw some topics out and then we can talk about it if you want, if people have insights that go beyond what I'm going to talk about. And the other thing I want to, I guess, warn you about is that a lot of these ideas that I was coming up with and gelling around in my brain are interreliant, interconnected, and I can't really see necessarily a linear sequence of how they're connected. And so things may be a little jumbled as I jump back and forth between different principles. But some of you probably, Richard Dawkins was mentioned earlier as an author that's been influential on a large number of atheists. He has his critics, even among those of us who appreciate what he's brought to the discussion. But he published probably his most notable book. In fact, some people say the most notable scientific impact of any lay-directed book was called The Selfish Gene. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today depends a little bit on that concept. And really, just to kind of get you started in thinking about this, the idea of a gene as an entity, discrete from the body that carries it around. And so we're going to talk some about what the definition of an individual is, or an entity. And you can take it down to the level of an individual molecule. Physicists might even say that the entanglement between photons suggests that maybe there are concepts of entity between subatomic particles. But certainly we can expand it upward and outward as well and suggest that a community of folks like us also is an entity. And so there are various levels of organization of what is defined as an entity. And what Dawkins was really motivated about and wanted to try to convey was the idea of what it is that's capable of replicating itself independently. And certainly as individuals, we sometimes think about that with regard to reproduction, but a gene reproduces itself as well. And it's impacted the way I've come to think about the way we interact in groups and the evolution of a concept like altruism, which Dawkins really emphasized a lot in his book, which is the idea that we can work in ways that provide support and survivorship, success for an entity that's beyond ourselves, a family, a community, and we have a natural tendency to do so that seems to have come about through evolution. And there are some forces at work in the world today that suggests that maybe that's a bit of an obsolete utility in our arsenal. And that saddens me to think that, but it's something I feel like I have to confront, just to consider the possibility. I'm not convinced yet. But so altruism, I think most ethologists and evolutionary biologists would agree, arose through this concept of a selfish gene and the idea that it makes sense for an individual, human, a person, to act in ways that are selfless if it promotes the survival and propagation of genes that individual is carrying. And so the simplest way to think about it, probably the most, the one that makes the biggest connection with us immediately is the idea of promoting and supporting our children, because they're carrying our genes forward into the next generation. But there are examples from biological systems, really, really common in the insect world, for instance, where individuals work to support the survivorship and success of their siblings at the expense of reproduction. So some of you are aware, perhaps, of honeybees, social arrangement. The worker bees actually do not reproduce, but they work really hard to support the hive. And that's because they're essentially clonal. Those bees are more closely related to one another than they are even to their own queen or the drones that inseminated the queen. And that's just a consequence of the way genetic recombination occurs. We'll look a little bit at that, mechanisms of that. During meiosis and the formation of the gametes, the sperm and the egg, that sexual reproduction involves. But you can extend that, to other kinds of groups, including human groups, where very often soldiers risk their lives for the sake of their country. Perfect strangers will risk their lives to save one another from imminent danger. But it tends to come from some motivation that's a very complex psychological system set up by a multitude of genes. And those genes all have to work together, and that's one thing we're going to kind of focus on here, is the way and reasons why genes work together. So Dawkins likes to talk of replicators or replication units, and I guess he also refers to the individual that's carrying a genome as a vehicle, and that's a really useful analogy, I think. And so one thing we might consider is the idea of an individual person using a mass transit system to get to work maybe 2 or 3 towns away, where they might have to switch buses. They might, from one day to the next, take a different bus to get there on time. And so they might do things to promote and support the existence of that transportation system because it's going to get them where they need to get. And a gene can be thought of as doing that with regard to its vehicles that carry it around. So it depends, to some extent, this concept of altruism depends on survival of the fittest group. By the definition of altruism, we're not talking about selfish interests, we're talking about interests in the tribe or the village or the state in which we exist. And it's important to consider that there are surrogate markers and drivers of kinship that are operational. So we'll look at this in a little bit more detail in a moment, but there may be genes that are not directly involved in altruism that contribute to the success of the vehicle. And the kinship distance over which we extend this altruism it depends to some extent on what kind of sacrifice we're making, how we perceive that, how sacrificial that act appears to be to the operator, and also to some extent on the linkage of various genes to one another. And we'll talk about the distance, physical distance on chromosomes and how that affects that distance. But one thing that's occurred to me is that we've spent most of our human history evolving not only as individuals but as groups. So individual tribes and clans survived together through cooperation, built out of this altruistic tendency that we have. And therefore, there were times maybe where villages weren't necessarily competing with one another, but they were responding to threats and challenges differently from one another. And those that were most successful are the ones that survived as a group. And that group was interbreeding, right? So they were sharing genes. And so that whatever cooperativity or planning for the future or other kinds of organized thought that they had or even learned cultural elements, those evolved together and stayed together and promoted this cooperative attitude that altruism exists among. That has largely gone away in human society now. We're globalized. We're a syncytium of people that moves dramatic distances rapidly. We exchange thoughts, ideas, and genes, sexual fluids over without division anymore. And so that cohesiveness that is required for altruism to support the survival of that group is no longer motivated to the same extent it was. And kind of connected to that, to some extent, is what I see as a threat to the very system of government we've come to learn to love. If you think about it, numbers have always had power, right? When you had a despot that was abusing his people to some extent, there very often was an uprising where just the sheer number of torches and pitchforks could overcome whatever army he had assembled, right? So numbers do matter. You could eventually probably always reach a number that could surmount, even the power of a king's army. So at some point we decided, well, there might be a bloodless way to do that. Maybe we can just take a vote. we can play out this battle in a game-like scenario. We can put it on paper and say, okay, if it was us against them, who would have the numbers? And that you can think of really as kind of where democracy came from. But it's important to recognize that wealth makes wealth, the rich get richer, and so there are trends, I think, throughout human history that have really taken on exponential growth lately, whereby wealth can assemble a technological advantage that might make numbers really almost irrelevant. So once wealth is allowed to intervene in our politics in the way that it has in recent years, it's only going to feed on itself and promote systems, tax structures, other kinds of laws and regulations that support the oligarchy, right? So that's a little disappointing and scary to me. One thing that's important in where I want to go with talking about this is a physical principle called entropy. And entropy really is just an expression of this age-old adage that Aristotle gave us, which is that it's possible to fail in many ways, while to succeed is possible usually in only one way, or maybe a very small number of ways. And that's really just based on odds. That's just the probability. Because for a system to function correctly, all the parts have to be moving and functioning, interacting together in the way that they should, right? And when you have a large number of moving parts, then the probability that one of those is going to fail is pretty good. But the probability that you can get them all working together and nothing's going to fail is actually kind of small. And that's kind of wrapped up in the idea of entropy. Some of you probably have heard of entropy, right? It's a physical principle that chemists would say drives all chemical reactions. Physicists would say it's a manifestation of the structure of our universe, and that the very nature of time depends on entropy. But what it really is defined is disorder, chaos. And we tend to think of order as being geometric or spatial, but there's also some order involved in information, and those actually there's a two-way street there. So information is very often a reflection of things organized in a way that's physical. But an example that's often given is the molecules of gas in a box like this, where you can see if they're all aligned with equal distribution, but in distances and in nice neat rows, that's order. But that's not the way gases usually perform in a box, right? They usually spread out chaotically. They move around at what appear to be random motions and distances from one another. And it is actually much more probable for that to happen than for things to be organized. So if you think about, for instance, if you dumped a pile of bricks out of a truck, they're not going to land in a nice neat stack, probably, right? What's the probability of that? They're going to land in a disordered, chaotic jumble. So again, it's just the odds of the way things are going to happen. We can take that gas example and look at perhaps a mixture of different gases. So if we had oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide together, we could arrange those so that they are actually adjacent to the molecules of a like gas are arranged in relationship to one another spatially. But then entropy would dictate that becomes chaotic and they spread out and diffuse like that. But you can actually put things in order if you apply energy. So one of the principles of entropy is that the flow of energy is always dissipating. Our universe is expanding. Things are becoming less energetic with that expansion. The universe is cooling off. It's not losing energy, but the energy is dissipating and spreading out. But if you can concentrate energy and apply it to a system, that energy can result in an order. And to order things would always take energy, right? That's why it's difficult for us to clean our houses. It takes effort to put things back in order. And so what about Earth as a system in an entropic universe? We get a lot of energy from the sun, obviously. If I ask for a show of hands here, people who feel like, do we put back into the universe the energy that we get from the sun? How many would say that it would be equal? Are we absorbing some energy and keeping it here? Or are we dissipating it back out? Who would agree that we're keeping more energy than we're keeping some of that energy? Actually, it's an intuitive kind of thought, but that's not the case. Actually, all of that energy is going back, and it's kind of a complicated explanation that we may not have time to get into today. But that energy is allowing for an order and a structure here, so it is anti-entropic or enthalpic. But ultimately, that energy is being released, mostly as heat, I guess, to a large extent. A little bit of light, but mostly heat. We also have a little bit of energy, of course, coming from our geothermal sources. That's really not quite the same thing as that which the sun is providing us. And it itself has a limited and finite lifespan. The Earth is constantly cooling, so we are losing that to some extent. But that energy does come through the system and provide for force working against entropy in some respects. And a really good example is plants making sugars. So, I forgot a pointer here. Okay. Yeah. So the sun's energy is absorbed by a molecule called chlorophyll that's present in plants and a few other organisms that they use then to combine CO2 and water to produce this complex molecule of glucose. They also produce fructose and a few other sugars, but we can just use glucose as an example. If you can think about that as the way that is organized, the bonds between the atoms are of uniform distance, and it takes on a very ordered shape. There's obviously less entropy here than there is in the chaotic dispersal of CO2 and water molecules from which it arose. Those plants and the animals that eat them are undergoing a process called biocatabolism, where they're breaking down that structured glucose molecule back into its constituent. Let's see. Guess I lost that. Back into its constituent CO2 and water molecules, and you can see that those, are probably going to disperse and be chaotic in their organization. So that destruction of order of the glucose molecule is an example of entropy. Okay, so that actually extends to living beings along the whole spectrum of organization currently and certainly throughout evolution. Starting with really simple organisms that were originally unicellular, those became then growing in colonies, organized into multicellular organisms that became more and more ordered and sophisticated to the point where they could develop muscles that move them around, they could develop brains that control those muscles. Mammals eventually and probably some reptiles before them, certainly some reptiles before them, gained the capacity to control their own body temperature. So that's a little bit higher level of control of their internal environment. Primates evolved eventually. They had really sophisticated social structures and eventually gave rise to a primate that we identify with a little bit more directly. So we had this evolution toward what I think everyone would have to agree is a much more anti-entropic organism, an organism that's very capable of not only being organized, but organizing things itself, inventing tools and structures that allow him to examine his universe outward and inward, and to develop systems of organizing that information through information technology, perpetuating it, communicating it to one another. So we have now the ultimate defiance of entropy that we've ever seen anywhere in the universe. The human species is the most sophisticated product this universe has ever created. And it's because of the concentration of energy in the sun and a few other really special things about the composition of the Earth, its distance from the sun, what that allows for in the sense of liquid water and other elements and molecules that can come together to form, really, frankly, that organized structure of glucose that I showed you can really only happen with carbon because of the way carbon's bonds are capable of forming. So the elements that comprise the Earth really are very special, and their balance here is pretty special. The odds, that this is the only place in the universe that this exists are really infinitesimal. I mean, it seems overwhelmingly likely that this has occurred somewhere else. But we don't know that. We really don't. We don't know how special it is to have a moon that creates tides, that create tide pools, that allow for organisms to move in and out of the water such that they evolve, to eventually walk on land. We don't know really just how many planets there are out there that have just this right sweet spot. And yeah, there probably are some more, but we don't know that. So right now, we probably ought to treat this as the most special thing that we have evidence for. And we should treat ourselves as the most special thing that the universe has ever created. And it's important to remember now that it's energy that drove all this, and the energy from the sun putting all this system together. Okay, so let's jump just for a moment here toward Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene. So it's kind of an odd title, and he's been criticized for putting it this way. And he said sometimes in retrospect he wishes that he had said it differently. One thing that's important to note here is he's not talking about the gene for selfishness. right? That's often the first mistake people often have. What he's really trying to convey is the idea that something like a gene can exhibit behaviors that mimic selfishness. And really, if you broaden it out, what he's really ultimately trying to say is that we ourselves are simply operating in a selfish way when we are, that we aren't necessarily of a selfish quality. We are machines that behave that follow the rules that we would associate with selfishness. And it's really easy for us to take that term as we learn it, initially growing up in our culture. We apply that to individual humans, but it can be applied to other things in the same way that intelligence can be applied to a machine. You can think about it as metaphorical, or you can think about maybe in the opposite sense that nothing is truly intelligent. Maybe we're only as intelligent as machines can be. Maybe we are only as selfish as a gene can be. And then, this really doesn't have an important moral statement to make unless you define morals or ethics as part of the system that allows a group or a society to function. So good or bad is really just relative to what that individual sees as good or bad for him, or what that gene sees as good or bad for propagation. And it was based to some extent on some older work from a guy named Hamilton, not the statesman, but a scientist who lived in the 20th century, who said that despite the principle of survival of the fittest, the ultimate criterion which determines whether a gene that will represent G is spread is not whether the behavior is to the benefit of the behavior, the animal, the conduit, the vehicle, but whether it's to the benefit of the gene. And with altruism, this will only happen if the affected individual is a relative of the altruist, therefore having an increased chance of carrying the gene. There are a few other ways in which genes or other kinds of entities or identities can propagate themselves, but this is the most straightforward way, and the way that Hamilton really wanted to emphasize at that time. Another really text-heavy things here. I don't have to read all of these. I just want to point out essentially that Dawkins himself wrote that Darwinian selection does not work on the genes directly. So it's important to note that it's really the manifestation of that gene, the behavior it creates, that's important. And it even manifests as, eventually as tools that reach outside of the individual. So beavers build dams, birds build nests. We have all the technology and instruments that we've built. Those are manifestations of our genetic tendencies, and they are used in survival and in propagation of individual genes. One thing I want to get at and emphasize pretty heavily here is the surrogate behaviors or indirect ways in which genes interact with one another and with the behavior. Dawkins recognized, as did a lot of people as they first confront evolutionary theory, that something like birth control seems initially as kind of counterintuitive. On the simplest, most straightforward sense, birth control is it runs counter to the tendency or desire of the individual to reproduce himself or herself, and therefore, you would think there would be genes that would override that tendency of us to use birth control as well. Dawkins provides the simplest, most easiest explanation for that, which is that ultimately the survival of the group might depend on controlling population to the point where it doesn't reach an excess, overwhelming its carrying capacity of its environment. This Malthusian model of population growth, you don't want to reach a population that becomes top-heavy and depletes your food supplies and such. But there's another explanation that probably has occurred to most of us, which is that there's a surrogate purpose to some of the behaviors we have. So, for instance, we develop sexual desire, a libido, that is fundamentally underlying our behavior, that does not take into account propagation or replication. It's independent of that. We desire to have sex with another individual very often for reasons that have nothing to do with thought about about future generations. So that's an example of a type of behavior or a set of behaviors that indirectly results in the in passing the set of genes along to the next generation. And so it is very often then essential that genes act in synergy with one another. And there's some really interesting mechanisms by which this can happen, but it really is almost the only way that an individual gene can promote its extension into subsequent generations. Another example that Dawkins uses in his book is a fungal infection that affects insects like bees. And it turned out that through some selective breeding, it was determined that, well, first of all, their defense against that fungus is they take the infected, I guess it's a nymph stage, and they eject it from the hive. And if they do that often enough and get rid of enough of them, then they can overcome this infection as a community. But it turns out if you really work this out genetically, you can find that there are two behaviors that are combined. One of them is breaking the pod open in which the larvae exists in its state, and the other is actually kicking it out. And so you can actually breed those behaviors out of the bees separately. So it's those two different things that have to work together. And so if they're not both combined, then you don't get the advantage. Okay, so another important concept is that selfishness of an individual person is a failure. We talked about this. It's easy to think about that with regard to a person, but other divisions, smaller or larger, can be selfish as well. Any replicator can be in dynamic tension with its survival machine, with its vehicle. So a gene, if it is a replicate, it's trying to replicate itself, there can be some situations in which that runs counter to the overall well-being of the entity. There's only in this mathematical maximization of that relationship that you see optimal function. So I want to get in just a little bit to the structure of genes so that we can understand how some of these processes are conveyed. Probably most of you know that DNA comprises 4 different nucleotides, so there are really only 4 different molecules that are inherited genetically. Now, there are modifications of those that arise in what we call epigenetics, but it's really just those, as far as genetics goes, it's really just those 4 nucleotides combined in different sequences to create a gene, and they pair up in very predictable combinations with one another to create this double-stranded structure that's the DNA. And that DNA is a replicon itself, or a replicator. It evolved the capacity over eons to promote the production of a system that would include protein enzymes, RNA molecules that are similar to but a little different from the DNA, that all work together to replicate the DNA. And that seems to be its raison d'etre. It seems to be the only reason it exists, and probably the only reason its carriers or vehicles exist, which is to replicate that thing and just make that more and more copies of that. And that's really kind of the central dogma of molecular biology, the way these are, the way this information flow occurs. And it's important to point out that this information is, again, related to the concept of entropy. So one of the ways things can be organized is in thoughts and ideas or bits and bytes, binary ones and zeros. An organization of that in a way that makes sense defies entropy, and it takes energy to create that. Now, in that replication, mistakes are made, and those are, the simplest way we think of that is mutations. And mutations are often thought of as bad, but of course we can't have evolution without mutations. And so some degree of looseness in that replication or problems in the faithful replication are actually advantageous. And so what that can result in is a single nucleotide being wrong. And that's really probably the most common mutation that occurs. But some can be much larger. You can have entire regions of genes that are duplicated and then replicated within the gene, and that creates some redundancy of function or some other kind of structural advantage to the protein that's ultimately made. You can have entire, really large regions that contain tens or scores of different genes replicated. We didn't really recognize the extent to which this contributes to human diversity until really recently, when we developed the technology to sequence really long pieces of DNA at one time. But it turns out that we differ quite a lot in the copy number of certain genes. Some of them have been flipped and replicated and reinserted in different places among our ancestors that are different between me and Bern, for instance. And one really practical consequence of this is carpal tunnel syndrome. It turns out that people who are prone to carpal tunnel syndrome have a different genomic structure over these really large replicated areas. But what this is a mechanism for things to change, right? To allow evolution. And so there are myriad ways in which these mutations can occur, and sometimes they're very small, and sometimes they're very large, and they allow for a really complex array of different kinds of changes. But what's important to remember is that we have to define a gene as that thing which replicates faithfully long enough to be considered, generational. So we tend to think of a gene as molecular biologists and biochemists who look at the ultimate function of the protein. We tend to think of the gene as a correct assembly of all the introns and exons that are going to come together and create this functional protein eventually. But really, it could be only a portion of that sequence that is the gene, if that sequence is replicated faithfully and that creates some useful function or change in function. It doesn't even have to be useful. So that's a way to define that. A gene behaves, a sequence behaves like a single gene if it's rarely split up, if it tends to propagate and be moved into the next generation. So a gene is any set of nucleotides that travels together during the process of meiosis, and meiosis is that process that occurs during the development of gametes. determine whether it's to your best advantage to foster the success of a brother, or a mother, or a cousin, or a second cousin, or a third cousin, or an uncle. That. We don't think about it consciously, and our genes don't really compute that in the way that they're structured as well. Instead, they use these surrogate kinds of things, these surrogate motivations. That we have for relatedness is appearance. So skin color, height, certain bone structure, other things that we recognize as familiar. We've developed genes that use those as shortcuts to help us define relatedness, and so we operate based on those principles to a large extent, rather than a real computation of going through a family tree and figuring out how closely related we are to one another. Yeah, just get back to this idea of surrogate markers. There is this example from the microbiology field. Did you know about this? Toxoplasma gondii. It's a bacteria. No, sorry, it's not a bacteria. It's a unicellular organism that requires, for part of its life cycle, to pass through the digestive system of a cat. And it just has evolved that way, where it really can't propagate unless it goes through a cat. And what it does when it infects a mouse is it actually causes that mouse to lose its fear of cats, so that it will run up to the cat and be consumed. And so think about this unicellular organism that does not have a brain has somehow figured out a way, operationally, machine-like, to evoke a behavior that promotes its propagation. And it's done so, without thinking, right? So why couldn't a gene do the same thing? So here's an entity, this little cell, that's capable of being a replicator in a way that's successful through that really elaborate effect on mouse behavior. So let's talk for a second about what is an individual. Where can we draw the lines between different entities? And I'm going to do this with the concept of the replicator as sort of the essential element of what the individual is. We can, of course, break our cells down into individual cells, and this is kind of a nice little diagram of what a cell comprises. For most of the time during the lifespan of that cell, the DNA is going to be confined within the nucleus. You've got other organelles that are doing various functions. One that we often think and hear a lot about is the mitochondrion, the powerhouse of the cell. It's taking sugars and other fuels we can consume and converting it into ATP, which is a really good universal currency for energy in the cell. But how many of you knew that mitochondria were not always with us? Mitochondria actually represent a prokaryote, a bacteria, that's gotten into our cells, sometimes way before we were people or even animals. This bacteria inserted itself in another larger bacteria and allowed the creation of what we call a eukaryotic cell. And this eukaryotic cell is one that has the nucleus where it separates the DNA from all the other components and some other interesting facets. But one of the markers of a eukaryotic cell is it has these organelles that came from another species. And it's so intrinsic in us now, we can't live without them, that we don't think about it as another species. But ultimately, a long time ago it was. And the same is true of the chloroplasts, represented here by the screen, that have the chlorophyll that allow plants to make sugar out of sunlight. So where's the individual there? I mean, we can't exist really as a pure, original thing. We have to have this contaminant, or this infectious agent that creates really the most, I guess, the ultimate form of symbiosis. And then kind of ordering things upward from that individual cell, you have organisms that are what we call multicellular, right? Slime molds actually can live either as single cells or as a multicellular animal-like structure. I guess people would kind of think of them looking more like plants, but they have defined cell types that do different functions in this organized structure that they can ultimately form. But they can also, usually under conditions of stress, they break apart into individual cells that are free living and don't organize or work together in any way. But then they can come back together to form this entity. So that's kind of an odd concept, that they can be unicellular or multicellular. So, you know, we tend to think of these orders of an entity. I mentioned the individual molecules, nucleotides that make up the DNA. Each of those is a separate molecule that's pushed back entropy far enough to have this organized structure. And then those can be lined together into a sequence that forms what we might think of as a gene. And we've just discussed a lot about how those genes behave independently and selfishly. The genes form a really essential element for the function of individual cells. Those cells come together to form an entire organism. And for this kind of a sophisticated multicellular organism, we kind of tend to think of specialization of those cells as being important. We have different cells, like neurons, that function really differently from the blood cells. And so we couldn't create this sophisticated multicellular organism without that specialization. But then we also have an entity like the hydra, for which most of the cells there are pluripotent. You can break a hydra up into its individual cells. It's essentially an animal, but you can break the cells up, and each individual cell can form a whole new hydra. So that's a kind of interesting concept of what is an individual. You see this on a tree or a rock. It's lichen, right? What is lichen? You think it's a fungus? You think it's a mold? It's actually a combination of at least 3 different species, all working together to form this structure. They can't live without each other, and you can't form lichen without working together. So what is lichen an entity? Is it a thing? Is it a community? It's kind of hard to define, right? Aspen trees. Some of you probably know this, but the largest living organism on Earth is an aspen forest. It is one single organism. Somewhere in Colorado, this is not it. Actually, it's much bigger than this, but all of these trees are connected to one another, and that's as true of most aspen groves. The trees are actually just as individual stalks of one great big giant plant that might take many, many acres. So we think of the trees as individuals, but they're not. The mitochondria that I mentioned inhabit our cells. You know, there's a picture here showing just one for simplicity, but there are dozens or hundreds of mitochondria in each individual cell. They are themselves replicators. They replicate themselves independently of the cell. So you can have a cell that has only 5 mitochondria. Those mitochondria can split and divide within that one cell to form hundreds of mitochondria. And so they are sort of evolving and undergoing natural selection within a single cell. That changes over a period of a person's lifetime because those mitochondria are carrying their own genome. It's another thing that marks them as being something outside of their original host. They have their own genes, their own chromosome. Even the numbers of those the copies of those chromosomes can change within a single mitochondria. But what often happens during the aging process, and this has been documented most clearly in neurons and muscle cells, but mitochondria, an individual mitochondria can undergo a mutation that makes it divide at a higher rate, but yet compromises the function that we think of it as having of producing ATP for us to function. And so there was this really neat paper that came along quite a long time ago. When was that? 2002. That documented mutations that promote the survival and replication of the mitochondria, but compromise the health of the cell. And this probably contributes to some of the effects of aging. So it's a manifestation of 2 different replicators working together in some senses, and other times at cross purposes. And so there's always this dynamic tension between the different replicators and how long they decide to ride along together in the same vehicle. It was kind of a neat system, the way they you know, if anybody wants to go into the science, but the way they discovered these events. But essentially what it does is causes a loss of function of a key enzyme for ATP production. And without having to waste time and energy on that, the mitochondrion can grow and prosper and divide a little faster. So again, I'm going to get back to this surrogate purpose, or these markers that tend to produce the ultimate effect, even without a rational intent to do so. We talked a bit about this degree of relatedness and how that defines how altruistic we're going to be toward one another. Racial prejudice is a manifestation of this sort of surrogate marker of kinship that's based strictly on physical appearance. And it's something that I think we can all agree is a problem that has not been solved by our biology and not by the systems we've devised to try to overcome problems with our social organizations. So our politics and other systems of interaction have not solved this problem. And it's becoming, I think what some people would suggest, a bigger problem as the 21st century progresses. This is some elections in Germany in 2017 indicating a pretty big rise in the AFG party. This is one of the most right-wing parties in Germany, and they underwent in 2017 an increase in 8% of their winners of the electoral of the votes for parliament. And then in 2024, they made an even greater gain. This is happening all over Europe. Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Italy. Oh, is that a question? Or a comment?
I can hold on.
Okay, cool.
But I want to give you the opportunity.
Okay.
So in The Selfish Gene, my favorite chapter, the only one really was understandable fully by me, I guess, was the chapter on memes.
Uh-huh.
And how do you separate biology from the memeology in these things we're talking about? And you don't have to answer it now, just
Okay.
whenever you...
Yeah, it's a topic we can.
Sorry, thanks.
So this is on a bigger scale, the EU, overall parliamentary elections. For whatever reason, they tend to use blue to represent the more right-wing parties in Europe. And there was a pretty big gain in several of these, including a big one for the EPP in the last set of elections. And, you know, what I want to point out is that what's driving that, we hear this in the news quite a lot, but a lot of what's driving that is a fear of immigration, or a concern that a European nation is being sullied or somehow diluted in its racial purity. And Viktor Orban in Hungary is one who's really exploited that sentiment to a large extent. Equating migration with terrorism, and saying that what they're really trying to do is prevent importing problems of other civilizations into their own. So there's this fear, this xenophobia that seems to be underlying a lot of what's happening there, and even within the United States. And you know, a lot of what's driving that is the influx of people who don't look like them. People of African, sub-Saharan African descent, being driven largely by forces that really can't be ignored in equatorial parts of the world, which, as I'll mention in a moment, depends to some extent on climate change, but other things as well. So So what's happening there, one would assume, is that this surrogate use of appearance is affecting something deeply within the organization of these individuals and their functional set of genome, that it is intent on trying to promote the survival of genes that are like those of themselves. And what genetic analysis has taught us is that the differences between two white guys in Germany are much, much greater if you sequence all of the DNA than the differences between any African that's moving in to that area. So it's an irrational thing, but it's coming through these irrational operators that were evoked through evolution to try to promote kinship and survival of genes that are selfish. In this hemisphere, we see, again, a big influx from South and Central America into the United States, driving a lot of fear and xenophobia here that clearly played a big role in recent elections. One thing I want to point out, is that all of this depends on perceptions, and the perceptions are not always correct. The biggest influx into America of immigrants is from Asia. If you look at the thickness of these arrows is showing the numbers of people coming from these different areas. So yeah, a pretty good number from South America into North America. But as you and this is even a bigger issue if you separate legal versus illegal, documented versus undocumented immigrants. The vast majority of people here are undocumented are people that overstayed their visas. They way, way outnumber people that have just, jumped across the border. And they feel like immigration is threatening that. So many people are feeling a crunch right now in their own personal finances. And I would make the case that this is really more dependent on wealth disparity than on any individual or time-dependent change in our economy. And related to this, if you look at the rank order of these countries and the effects that they feel about their own finances, that really seems to be tied pretty closely to how they feel about accepting immigrants. So like Greece is having the most trouble with their finances and or feeling that they are, and also quite averse to immigrants. So we kind of step back now and talk again about replicators. Not all replicators are created equally. Among the individuals in our society, there are differences that we can ascribe to what we call wealth. And to some extent, that wealth is really just a reserve capacity or potential energy that can contribute to our fitness. And by fitness, I mean, ability to survive disadvantageous conditions. So wealth can be thought of really as just potential energy that can be applied to many other things, but part of it, what it's applied to, is our survival and our replication. And traditionally in human culture, there's been this dynamic tension between the elites or the nobles or whoever held the power structure and the vast majority of people who did not. They both needed each other. The nobles exploited the labor of large numbers of people in lower classes, and those in the lower classes depended on the nobles to some extent for their ideals of cohesion and leadership, and as a sort of a unifying factor in the storing up of resources and capital. But technology can create an imbalance in the ability of serfs to control the nobles. We talked about this at the very beginning, the ability of masses to stage revolt and overthrow their leaders can be overcome by technology, and that's the one thing that changes with time. We heard this quote very often that maybe history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. The reason it doesn't precisely repeat itself is because the one thing that keeps always increasing is our control of our tools and our resources in a way that, that we think of as this cumulative building of technology. Another thing that kind of is tied in with that financial issue is that there's a perception of threat by population growth. We fear that population growth seems to have reached an exponential stage. There's this fear that it could outpace the carrying capacity of the planet. Some of you know probably that India has now surpassed China as the most populous nation on Earth, but generally we still see increases in huge numbers of growth rates in various parts of the world, creating a perception that we might run out of space and resources. And, to be honest, we are doing things to our planet that probably do create additional threats to that sustainability, including climate change, creating problems with water and other supplies. But what's important to think about is this psychological effect that's driving the way we react to these. It depends on our perception of the threat more than the threat itself. Again, because the linkage between the markers and the surrogates and the actual outcome is not always a hard, fast, mechanistic linkage. So we know that monopolies are bad, right? Even though we have this game we like to play, but we have lionized Teddy Roosevelt for his initiation of antitrust measures. And so we tend to, I guess, want to oppose the development of monopolies, but they have a natural tendency to develop. Some industries are actually more natural than others, and some societies are more natural than others at creating monopolies, to some extent because of laws and regulations that we have to try to prevent them. But really, if you leave it unfettered, if capitalism is allowed to grow in the way that it is naturally predisposed to, it's going to concentrate resources and wealth in a way that makes that system, much more powerful now. Walmart was able to overcome a lot of the mom and pop stores because it had the resources to lose money on a few of its sales in order to pull people in and ultimately sustain the growth of this mega giant that the smaller entities couldn't compete with. And this is a concept we actually see in the natural world. If you take away control and let things just progress the way they will, there's this concept of ecological succession, where in the intermediate stages of the development of a habitat is a quite diverse mixed group of plants, and of course the mixture of animals that can thrive in that diverse environment. But it eventually progresses to something that's actually very, very much like a monoculture. Around here, the ultimate manifestation is oak and hickory forests. Really just those two species ultimately will arise that shade out everything else. They grow so tall, they get so much power in their height and their domination of the canopy that they shade out everything else, and you just have those two types of trees. You see that with primary succession and another thing we call secondary succession. Ultimately, it ends up the same place. There's this economist at University of Toronto, Blair Fix, who's kind of made this concept with regard to finances and economies a little bit more interesting by calling it the Gatsby curve. Just read a few components of what he has to say here. Income and wealth stem from social control. If you cede the control, if you take away the government regulations on capitalistic structures, they just grow bigger and bigger. So wealth begets wealth, they enrich themselves, and social mobility declines and inequality grows. Capitalism really isn't defined by its market, it's by property rights. Those are inherently regressive, meaning that they can be accumulated without end, handed over to the next generation, and bigger gets bigger. Not a hard concept. Without brakes or other kinds of levers and manipulators, an unfettered capitalistic system will grow in that way. It's succeeded to the extent it has in Western society through progressive restraints that place limits on property growth and perpetuation. So inherently regressive is an important point. Income equality in the United States seems to be, at least in the last few decades, we went through this maybe relative progressive period, and now it's kind of back on the rise again. Rise in average household incomes is really sloping upward only for the higher economic groups. So the lowest quintile is almost flat there. And so disparity is growing. And I've got several illustrations of this. People feel like there's too much wealth inequality in the country, but really it's not considered to be such a huge problem. So they don't know where their stress, their economic stress, financial stress is coming from, but they feel it. Real purchasing power is flat or maybe declining. The point of all this is to say that as this disparity grows, people are feeling threatened. They feel threatened for their own financial survival, and that adds to their level of stress, compounded by environmental concerns that they see, perhaps creating drought and famine. And resources seem to be, at a premium. This is really, again, getting in the weeds a little bit, but kind of interesting note here that if you look at just the richest people in America, going across a time scale from 1980 to to present time, the net worth of the richest individual, the one richest person, has gone up quite a lot. And you think, well, okay, inflation's gone up a lot too, but look at this. This is a log scale. So here's the growth from 5 to 10, and then 50 to 100 is there. The amount of wealth that Elon Musk has compared to what Sam Walton had is unbelievable. I mean, it's just astronomical. And that's true even for the second richest person. And it goes on to the third as well. So there's been this exponential, really logarithmic growth in wealth, concentration of wealth. And you see that even among the oligarchs, even among the richest people. If you look at the Forbes 400, there's still a trend upward that's much, much greater than the rate of inflation. And this is an interesting thing that Fix, this is again comes from this economist named Fix. A neat thing here about the relationship of an individual across time. So if you look at the wealth of an individual person like Sam Walton in 1985 versus 1986, it kind of jumped around a little bit. So they didn't correlate precisely. So Sam, if he's the paragon here, everybody else here, some of them were a little bit richer in 86 than they were in 85. And some of them were a little bit poorer in 85, in 86 than they were in 85. And so you see how scattered that is. The correlation coefficient, for those of you who understand that, is 0.64. But then if you jump forward to 2019 versus 2020, everybody almost falls on the line. What does that mean? Consistency, right? Once they've got that wealth, they're able to hold it. There's less volatility. And so that seems to be a symptom of this self-propagating, self-feeding ability of wealth to support itself and consolidate itself. Those of you who work with statistics some, you know about the bell curve and normal distributions. Height of humans is something we see with a normal distribution. There's a pretty small number of people who are over 6 feet. really small number of people who are under 5 feet, but we all tend to lie in the middle. Wealth is not like that. Wealth is not a normal distribution. The number of people who are really wealthy is really, really small. So what creates that likelihood or that shape of distribution? Well, it's not talent, because if you look at talent as measured by a constellation of factors that would predict success in school and in business, it reaches an almost normal distribution. And so how does this get converted to this disparity of wealth in this really abnormal distribution? Well, there's an interesting collaboration between economists and physicists that define mathematically that can really only occur through luck. And that what happens is that luck really strikes not so much out here at the end of the curve. It's much more likely to hit the largest number of people. It's got a bigger target to hit here, right? And what they show in this paper mathematically that explains really the really tiny small number of people that become really wealthy. It's because it's dependent on on luck rather than talent. Thousands of years ago, Polybius derived this cycle of governments and social organization that he thought was dependent on these cycles of countervailing trends, like the rise of the people here in a revolution to overthrow aristocracy and establish a democracy. But as I hinted at earlier, what if you have an overwhelming technological advance grasped by the aristocracy at this point? It seems to me that that's going to interfere with the ability of the people to assume their power and overthrow that kind of a hegemony. Just to remind you, get back to this idea of orders of entity. Individual molecules can be an entity. They can organize themselves into genes. Those genes shape and drive the organization of cells. Cells comprise an individual. An individual is a member of a family and ultimately a community. But as I would argue, our community is now a global community. And so this entire planet is going to survive or fail as one unit because we no longer have natural selection between competing villages as we did in our origins. It is possible for natural selection to affect groups, but we no longer have groups to the same extent. We now, at least with regard to the reproductive mechanisms that would combine and mix those genes with one another or promote one's survival over another, that doesn't really exist in these isolated entities that we used to comprise. So, again, because we are now global, I think we have to think about whether that threatens the persistence of altruism. And if some of the forces that we see at work in the world with regard to individual cultures and societies behaving toward one another reflects a misapplication of these forces that originally created altruism for our kinship, for our in-group, being perceived as a threat because of largely to the extent that it seems to be a zero-sum game. We don't have enough finances for everybody to thrive and survive, we think. But maybe that's really only because some of it's being taken out of the system and hoarded by the billionaires who are only getting further and further richer. Their distance from the common man is only getting greater and greater, and that wealth is being consolidated and not recycled into the economy in the way that could sustain all of us. So the perception then is we feel a threat, and the threat is one that we want to draw inward and look toward ourselves and promote the survival of ourselves, as a vehicle of the genes that drive these behaviors. But then, you know, if you relax that threat just a little bit, you could say, okay, my children can survive a little bit more, maybe my siblings, my family, extend that outward. You would hope it would move in that direction of an ever larger encompassing, you know, arms of generosity and compassion. But it seems at this point to be moving in the other direction and shrinking backward, and that scares me a little bit and makes me worry about the future of our social organizations. And that's where I'm going to stop. It's a depressing thing, I know, but and it's gone on pretty long too. I apologize for that. I didn't really get time to run through all this, but we had some ideas for discussion, and I think probably other people may have other comments or questions if they aren't exhausted.
Well,
Yeah, repeat that again.
Well, I won't be able to repeat it the way is it on?
Memes.
Yeah, the chapter on memes in Dawkins' book.
Yeah, for me, that's really a good example of this sort of disconnect between mechanistic forces versus those that are sort of riding along as an indirect combination, or a combination of indirect forces that work together to promote the survival and propagation of the vehicle.
It's something to think about.
Yeah.
You know, this culture and cultural identity would be, I think, within that chapter on memes, how those identities as concepts replicate and mutate and change over time.
I set my alarm this morning to wake up to music because KUAR doesn't come on as early as I wanted to on the weekend, so I have to wake up to something else. And so I had on this country music station, and what came across the first few songs were what we call now bro country. I don't know if people are familiar with this concept. They're no longer telling stories about, you know, my wife cheating on me and you know, and the bank taking away my truck and stuff. It's all about identity. Like the whole song is just about how good it feels.
Wow.
And it really seems to be like this big trend. And maybe nobody in here is a country music fan, but I'm sure that's manifested in other parts of our culture too. But identity politics is something we hear a lot about, and it's reflected not only in our politics but in our art. That we care a lot about right now what an individual's identity is and how he fits with his group. And I guess part of that is a manifestation. You know, to some extent, that's a manifestation of our need to feel like we've got a posse. We've got some people who have our back because times feel kind of threatening.
What station was that?
That was the Wolf, I think, which advertises itself as classic country, but they were playing some of this more modern bro country.
Yeah,
So they talk a lot about, you know, riding down a dirt road in the pickup truck, you know, with the beers, you know, and stuff, and just, you know, hanging out, you know, just being together, being tight, and being all this cohesive kind of mindset. And, you know, they've stopped telling stories. That kind of bothers me.
Levels that you described of what we can consider an entity that can replicate, you know, all the way down from molecules all the way up to communities and becoming a worldwide community at some point. But I also wonder if, you know, so evolution is operating on all these levels, or selection, maybe evolution is all hard, selection's operating. But I wonder if it's actually prosperity that is short-circuiting evolution, because, just to be frank, it's possible to be completely dysfunctional now and not starve to death, or, you know, not necessarily be murdered. Arguably, your reproductive success is not so much related to your functionality and what what memes you choose to subscribe to in this world where you can actually subscribe to different cultural values instead of having them ascribed to you. And so I kind of wonder if, if that is a factor that is perhaps driving feelings of instability in particularly Western countries where you've got these free flow of ideas, but there's no evolutionary pressure calling out the bad ideas or the dysfunctional behaviors.
Yeah, so what you're invoking is what people often call social Darwinism, right? The idea that we lose fitness by being communal and supportive, and that's I would hope that's not the case really. And I think the way I would answer that is to focus really more on the survival of groups, which used to be separated from one another. Within a village of 100 people, you probably couldn't afford to tolerate slackers and people who weren't productive, and so there was a social force there within that group that probably ensured that everyone was pulling his own weight. And so that group then, survived separately better than some other group that was admixing their genes, differently from this one. And what I would emphasize is that now we've lost that competition between these groups, where you might have had a social imperative to try to be, productive, if that's the word we want to use. And we've lost that because of this syncytium of people that we are now. Another way that's kind of often described or manifest is the anonymity that people feel in large urban environments. They often feel they can get away with anything because people don't really quite know their neighbors quite as well as we used to. If you lived in a community of 100 people, everybody knew what everybody's business was. And some unethical behavior arises when people feel like they can get away with something. I don't know, maybe we've reached now, we've gone back the other direction where we'd rather anonymous as at least this Mangione guy thought he was. He seems to have been trapped down.
Yes, it seems to me that as an evolutionary matter, we're all pretty much the same animals that we were before somebody figured out agriculture, before somebody figured out planting.
Yeah.
We haven't had enough time to evolve very much.
Very good point.
Even though we live in a society that is extremely different, in the same sense, it was also all created by human beings. Everything that we've got now was created by human beings, for human beings, with human ideas. So I think we do see cycles of things, and it seems to me that we want to gather in that 100 or 150 member tribe that we grew up in for, millions of years before we're talking about just humans, human-like hominids, I guess. But what I guess is the question I have is, if that is the case, are we really just basically cavemen adapting to a completely new scenario that we've set up? And that scenario is subject to change every time somebody has a new idea.
Yeah, I would agree. I feel like we probably are using genetic makeup that was not really designed for the culture we live in. I think that's one of the biggest problems we have right now. So the culture, technology and our culture have evolved much faster than we have. And we're really not well equipped to function in this culture.
Do you have any other questions? Well, Steve, I want to thank you for coming, and this is an extensive program you've devised, and I appreciate it, man. It's very in-depth, and it's given me some insight as to our society. I'd like to thank you for coming. And if you, let's see here. Let's see here, go back to the written stuff here. Thank everybody for coming today. That's the wrong page.
Mike.
I'm sorry?
Oh, hello, Mike. Mike's not here.
Okay.
If, like we said, no, it's not up there anymore. arfreethinkers.org is a great place to get in touch with us. We are also on Facebook at Arkansas Society of Free Thinkers, and be glad for you to check in with us on any of those. We're also on Meetup. Chris, what's the address on Meetup?
If you just look at meetup.com/AR Freethinkers, you'll find us.
That's AR Freethinkers / no, I'm sorry. Run that by one more time.
Meetup.com/AR Freethinkers.
Meetup.com /AR Freethinkers.
Yeah.
There you go. That's it. Anyway, that pretty well concludes our meeting today. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, please do. And don't forget that I forgot. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you all again third Sunday of next month as well. Thank you.